Okay. So leave your microphones on and we'll chant together. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu
Myoho Renge Kyo.
Namu
Myoho Renge Kyo.
Well, thank you. Well, that's a good way to begin the recording. So, pardon me, I'm coming down with some bronchitis, I think, between the temperature changes and traveling during this past week. So, make sure still recording, yes. Okay. So, last week, we talked about the first part of nonviolent communication, which is observe. And this is just noting the facts. What happened, what you saw, what you heard, without any judgment or value attached to it. This is hard to do. It's hard. Did any of you all try and do it this past week? Silence.
Maybe by accident. Sorry, I wasn't there last week, but I tried.
Good. So I take it that, of course, Davey wasn't able to join us last week, so he has no clue what I'm talking about. And Trey.
Well, I was going to say that I kind of tried, but my interaction with people has been fairly limited over the last week. And when I did interact with somebody, it was not very value or judgment free at all. Okay. So I have a good example to work with at the moment.
Well, that's okay. You don't need an example. So you tried, and it was difficult.
Very, very.
Yeah. We're very skilled at assigning judgment and value to the things that we perceive, whether they be seen, heard, felt, or whatever. So, and the reason why this is important to do is, in Buddhism we talk about self, non-self, and neither self nor non-self. And what we do when we assign value to things, instead of just making a clean observation, when we put ourself onto the interpretation of the event or the thing that occurred, then that's when we start constructing a story or a worldview or an idea that meets with our, or doesn't meet with our expectations. The driver who pulled his car in front of you is a jerk. That reinforces your worldview, your view of things as you being a good person and them being a bad person. And so, but we don't know that that person is a jerk. But that's the story that we tell ourselves because it makes us feel better. And it seems to give us power. But it also is the key to our suffering. When we assign value, when we do not make non-judgmental observations, whether it's, again, without me repeating this the same phrase over and over again about hear, see, or felt, just assume that that's what I'm talking about in all cases. So when we make a value assessment of something that we observe, we are then inserting ourself into that thing. And And that that is one of the keys to our suffering. When we become too attached to our own view or our own interpretation of the events that occurred, then we expect the world, or our perception of the world, to meet with or be in discord with our story, our idea of what things should be or should not be. And all too often, people do not meet our expectations in one way or another, or maybe they exceed our expectations in one way or another. So the idea is to remove yourself as much as possible from your observation of the events that occur around you. And then the opposite of that is when we remove ourselves too much, then we become dispassionate. And the trick is to find a happy medium. In other words, it's not self, it's not non-self, it's neither self nor non-self. Find that space in between, a healthy space in between, realizing what we have done by making a value assessment, by making a value judgment, and then choosing to ignore it or value it depending upon the circumstances. So if we become too dispassionate, then we eliminate love, we eliminate liking, we eliminate a lot of things. So, and we don't want to do that. We become unhuman almost. We become like Spock or Data, to borrow a couple of Star Trek characters. There may be others in movies and media, but they're the only two I remember. So, so is that clear? Is that understandable? Much of the discourse in our social media, and in particular regarding politics, is about you're either like me or you're not like me, and everything you say either fits with my worldview or it doesn't fit with my worldview. And if your statements are not in accord with my worldview, then you must be evil or you must be bad. And yet we don't know that. We just know that they disagree with us. When we're when we stand in the checkout line and the cashier is maybe not meeting our expectations of how fast they should be working, then we've made a judgment about that person based on information we don't have. And our judgment, more often than not, will align with what our prejudice is. And our judgment will more often than not align with our story of how we're building the universe. We create the universe. We create the world around us when we add values and judgments to things. But when we can stand back and examine things just based on the facts and strip away as much value and judgment as we possibly can, then that frees us from the suffering of the world not meeting our expectations. Any comments, thoughts, feedback at this point?
I think that's great. It's when we put these kind of values or judgments on things and they're not met, that is where the pain is for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's where the source of suffering is. And I like that. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. Trey,
Yes.
how are you processing this?
I was trying to just relate it to some ideas and some experiences I've had in my head, like what you were saying about how it's easy to find yourself in a group like, say, political affiliation or any type of affiliation and have an us or them mentality.
Mm-hmm.
I've always found that to be counterproductive. Instead of dialogue, we've created a platform for more like arrogance and kind of conflict, and that's a problem because no one's actually listening because we're so busy trying to defend our view, ourself, and our team, if you want to call it that. So I was thinking about how I see it in my environment.
Yeah. Neil?
I mean, it's a very difficult space to be working with in this moment in time, right? Certainly things feel like they're heading towards some very dramatic disequilibrium, right? And I think we all feel that in a sense, right? And I think that it's a different listening skills and the urgency there feel very different than they did just 5 years ago, right? So there's definitely a component of the time to that, to use, I think, one of Nichiren's favorite terms, if you know what I mean.
Right. And of course, this isn't just limited. I mean, I just used that example, and I don't want us to only insert ourselves into the situation with political discord. This exists in many places in society, that we assign a value to an action or something that occurred, an event, and then it from there we've created a story about that event, which may or may not be true, which then either makes us feel good or makes us feel unhappy. But the event itself is neutral. So while, yes, our political discord, the events in society are certainly big and important, it also happens in many small ways that contribute to our unease or our ease, our comfort or our discomfort in many ways in life. And so when we can do this, we will talk about, this is just one part of the nonviolent communication quartet of principles. The next one we'll talk about is feelings. So we're just observing, and it's important to get this point of just making an observation without value judgment, without any kind of personal assessment of the situation or the event. We will come to, well, then what do you do with your feelings? We will come to that. But first we have to get to this point of being able to observe without judgment, without assigning values to the things that we observe. So we're not cutting ourselves off from feelings and all that stuff. They come later. But until we can see the difference, even if we're not good at doing it all the time, when we can come to see the difference and begin to gain the skill of just observing, just what do we know? What are the facts that we're aware of? If we don't have all the facts, then we don't have all the facts. And knowing that, admitting that, I just don't have all the facts. Lately I've been going through news feeds, and there's very little news anymore. Most of the stuff that is being foisted off on us as news is just opinions, someone's assessment of something. Well, I don't really need that. I need information. I need facts. And so, when we can do this, I think we actually increase our ability to function in a healthy way in our society, in our life, regardless of what's happening to us. So I'm reading from my scribbled notes. I'll show you. That's what it looks like. So I can barely read it three or 4 days later. So some of this came to me while I was driving to Buffalo, and I had to pull off the freeway. There's like only every 30 miles or so is there a place to pull off the freeway on the New York Thruway, the big highway that cuts across the state of New York. So, so I pulled over to a rest place and made some notes, and then I made some notes later. So let me pick up here. So if we become too distracted, too dispassionate, then we become incapable of love or compassion. And that's when we'll get into feelings later. But first, just what happened? What is it that occurred? And so, you know, please don't think that this is impossible and this, you know, makes us some sort of automaton or something. Because again, there are other parts to this. But the first part is we have to be skillful at observing the facts. And this gets into, like I said last week, which did not get recorded, this gets into skillful mindfulness, skillful thought. So every instance that we interject ourselves onto the events, we subject ourselves to suffering. As Davy said, things either meet our expectation or they don't meet our expectation, and then we become unhappy or we become angry, and we want to make things conform to our worldview, the construct that we have placed on these events. Suffering because of change or because of mistakes. Let's see, I'm reading from my note. I can barely read these. I wrote this. Let's see. Okay. Suffering because of change or because of mistaken views bring us or ignore of ourself. You know, I better not read this because it doesn't make sense. I know what I wrote anyway. So the problem is that when we lose our perspective, if we lose the objectivity of our observation, we automatically revert to judgment, either good or bad. It's what we do. And then we create villains or heroes that fit into our construct of the story that we've create around this. So the person that cut you off is the villain. You're the good guy because you prevented the accident, because you slammed on your brakes. And, you know, thank goodness I'm the good guy and I'm watching out for the road because I saved us an accident. And see how well that plays into your overlay of what occurred, but really has nothing to do with what occurred. So, let's see. And so then when we do those things, the thing that occurred, the thing we're observing is no longer real in our mind. What's real is our construct of the world story. But that's what's false. And that's what will bring us suffering. Because the world doesn't operate according to our worldview. I'm sure that we all know that by now, that most of the world doesn't accord with your idea of how things should be. I'm pretty certain I know for me that's the case. You know, if the world just ran the way I wanted it to, I'd certainly be happy. To hell with everybody else, though, you know. So when we talk about this idea of no self, what we're talking about is don't put yourself into someone else's story. Don't put yourself into someone else's events. There'll come a time to honor your feelings. But again, this is done differently than I hate you or you're a jerk because you pulled out in front of me. Those aren't feelings. There's a place for feelings. There's a place for our reaction to the things that occur. But it's a separate process. But first, we have to be able to observe without judgment or without value assigned to that thing that we're observing, whether we hear it or see it or or read about it or whatever. Questions? Everybody has that. Yes, Dean.
I think a term that gets used a lot nowadays that's relevant to what you're saying is the term virtue signaling.
Is what? Wait, what?
Virtue signaling.
Okay, you'll explain that to us. I've not heard of
it. Well, the idea of virtue signaling is you do things. I mean, your motive is to prove to everyone what a good person you are, right? Like some people say, you know, driving a hybrid is virtue signaling, or calling your congressman is virtue signaling. Like you're doing things to reinforce this notion of yourself as a good person, or you're thinking, hey, I'm doing this because I'm a good person, not because of the inherent goodness of the act itself.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing it for the social dimension of it.
Okay. Yeah, I've not heard that expression before. I don't keep up with everything, so thanks for explaining that. So now, are you saying that that's good or bad?
Well, that's I think as described, as it is usually labeled on the internet, it's a pejorative term, right?
Okay. Yes.
You did this not because of the inherent good of the deed, but because of the social dimension, broadcasting dimension of it. And I personally think that's a bit of an oversimplification. I think people can, why you do things can be more complex than just a single root cause. Sometimes you do things partly because you want to be accepted as a good person, but also sometimes you just do them because you think they're the right thing to do, right?
Yeah, or even to encourage others to do that.
Right. So I don't know. I can see both ways of looking at that.
Okay. So, from the principles of nonviolent communication, that sort of comes in a further step. But it does sound very pejorative. That because someone's doing good, are they guilty? Can't they just do good? When we can observe, oh, they drive a Prius. End of story. There's nothing more to say. That's all we know, right?
Right.
So stepping back from that and practicing this nonviolent communication, or even skillful thought is, what do we know? What are the facts that we know? Without a judgment or an assignment of value, they drive a Prius. Maybe they have extra money to waste. I don't know. You know, maybe they are seeking status. I know when I had a hybrid Civic, I didn't care about status. The nice thing about the hybrid Civic is that it looked like just a regular Civic. And the only way you could tell was on the back, it said hybrid. I did it because I got a really good tax discount. It was quite affordable. It made sense. And I needed a new car. So, and also because I made arrangements with the dealership that if I was on that lot more than 20 minutes, I was going to not take the car. So have all the paperwork ready for me. It's a cash deal. I'll sign it and I'm driving out of there, or else I'm not taking your car. And they complied. So I hate car dealerships. Okay, Trey.
Yes.
Yeah. Questions, comments?
Not that I can think of. I feel like you're doing a pretty good job of explaining it for, what it is. It's, the whole observe without, injecting judgment or values or, the list goes on and just seeing it as it is. Like, that's one of the thoughts that came to my mind when you mentioned the hybrid is, it could be somebody's driving it because they borrowed it because they don't have a car, or it could be, we don't know. Like,
yeah, it could be a rental.
They're in a hybrid. Yeah, all we know is that they're in a hybrid. And
that's
one example, of course. There are many, but I was taking note of that because it's certainly worth contemplation. Like, I find myself getting into that thought sometimes a lot too. And I'm like, well, I really don't know their story. So that would be a good way to kind of shut that down, is recognizing that I only know that it's a person in a hybrid.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as I was saying, Neil, and as Neil noted, there are many possible conclusions to jump to about the actions of someone. But what are the facts? What do we know? What do we know? Someone shared their experience of calling their senator. Do I feel shame? See, this gets into the other parts that we haven't covered yet of NVC. Is maybe I felt ashamed. Maybe I felt angry. So we can honor our feelings, but the feelings have to be based on facts, not assumptions. You driving a Prius makes me angry because you're an arrogant SOB. That's not legitimate. I don't know what that person driving the Prius is. So my feelings are false. They're based on a false assumption, a false conclusion. But when I see someone driving a Prius, and it's just a Prius, and man, I'm happy. I'm happy somebody cares about the environment. Maybe they don't care about the environment. I don't know. Maybe they're like, well, I mean, I care about the environment, but I tell you, it was the price that got me to buy the Honda Civic, the hybrid. $4,000 off tax rebate. It's a pretty good deal. And it wasn't all altruistic, my reasons for buying the hybrid. Now, maybe it made somebody feel good. I know I'd occasionally get comments, oh, I'm glad you're driving a hybrid or something like that, especially in Oregon, which is where I drove it the most. So, yeah, I mean, we will get to, so please don't think that you can't feel anything. We just need to become skillful at understanding when we're making a value assessment or a judgment on something for which we really don't know. Davey.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think, when we bring our values, our judgment, or even our preconceptions to events, to people, we're kind of setting ourselves up to fail sometimes because we don't know. We're putting our stuff on them, or and we're doing them a disfavor really, because we're assigning the stuff that we have on them or the situation, or and I really get that. It's
Yeah.
With my dad at the moment, I don't see my dad an awful lot, but even before he comes, I kind of have these preconceptions, all this,
I'm sorry. Hold on. It wasn't real clear what you said. So did you? Let me repeat back what I thought I heard. So when your dad comes, you got a preconception.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
There's kind of stuff around that. There's why is he coming? What's his problem? It's all comes from me, and if I went purely by the facts, I would think very differently.
Yeah. It's hard to do.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, your comment reminds me of, when I would go visit my parents when they were alive. Visiting my mother was just hell. The visit was never just a visit. First off, there's the story that I would construct prior to the visit. There was her actions, which either jived with or didn't with the story that I constructed. And most of the time it did. So that validated me, which made the whole thing even worse, because even though I was right, I was still suffering because my mother did that. But my mother didn't do anything. I did it. If my mother could make me suffer and put me in hell, then gosh darn it, then she could have made me enlightened. Nobody has that kind of power. We give it to them.
And I think that pain we feel because we don't go purely on the facts, we assign to them. It's their fault. It's the reason why. When us. Yeah.
Anybody else do that in our crowd? Yeah, a little bit of nod there from Trey. I can't see what Neil's doing.
It's a very common thing. I know that it's common throughout the world, right? Where I live in the South, these kinds of things are almost about everything. It can be like whether or not you're, talking to a Catholic, or, whether it can get really weird around here as far as like these preconceptions and these, stories, like your story constructs that are already in place. And I feel like it's a real challenge in this area because the things are very shut down when it comes to that kind of mentality, like, the story construct for pretty much everybody. Like, for example, say I see you and I'm from one of just the average homes around here, and you have tattoos all over you. It's assumed pretty much automatically that you are most likely criminal or dangerous.
Yeah, I'm real dangerous.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like around here, though, I've caught a lot of it myself, but I've also been guilty of a lot of it myself, because I'll look at somebody that I'm like, that's an evangelist Christian. They're crazy. I'll start coming up with all these things in my head, and
yeah,
I actually don't know if they're just going because they're supporting a spouse, or if they really even care to be there. They might just be, somebody that just likes to have something to do on Sunday. I don't really know. I find myself getting judgmental with them back, and
yeah,
it's a two-way relationship. It really is.
And then, when we do that, we look for subtle signals that confirm our assessment.
Yeah.
We see things in people's movements, in their manner of speech. I'm guessing that you all, well, maybe you aren't like me. Maybe I'm the only one that does this. But when I notice that I'm doing this judgment over the assessment of something I observe, that I can pick up on all kinds of little signals that validate my assessment. But I don't know that it does, because I don't know anything about that person. but yeah, they're a Christian, so they must be evangelical, and they must hate gay people. And so, yeah. And then I see them, a little facial expression. Yeah, I was right. You know? Yeah, they're wearing flannel. They must be a redneck. So, Davey, are you catching any of this? We're primarily talking about Southern politics here.
No, I completely understand. I know what flannel is as well because I have some flannel shirts.
Yeah. So if you're in the South and you're wearing flannel, you're probably a redneck.
Yeah. People said to me, "You look very redneck." Yeah, but the same thing.
And heaven forbid if you drive a truck.
Well, exactly. No.
Especially if it's beat up. That probably means your house is on wheels. So see how we do these stories. I mean, you know, we have our preconceptions, our prejudices, and they make us feel better because we're not like them. My house isn't on wheels, you know? And there's nothing wrong with a house being on wheels. For many people, it's the only option, you know. I knew a real good lady, an elderly Japanese lady who it's all she could afford to keep a roof over her head. The only problem was that the floor in the mobile home was rotting out. So while she had a roof over her head, she didn't have much of a floor.
No.
Yeah. And one could look at that situation and think that she was just some sort of redneck or something, or a Japanese version of a redneck, whatever that would be. But really what it was is she just had no other options. She had no money. You know, she didn't like it, but she didn't have any choice. You know, so she's working at a meat processing plant. She didn't like, you know, it was not her idea of an ideal job. But it's the only thing available in that area of North Carolina. Neil, you know about that. There's some areas.
Oh, yeah.
Some areas of North Carolina where you're either going to kill pigs or you're going to kill chickens. You know?
Yeah, and you're thankful for the opportunity for that even. You know, there's things in places in East North Carolina I've been that, well, of course I grew up in a very poor area of West Tennessee, so I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, when I would visit the prison in Kentucky, you know, I drive through coal country, you know, and these are poor people. And, you know, we might call them ignorant, but I don't think they're any more ignorant than someone who lives in a nice suburban home, you know, outside of a large city, attending private schools. They're just differently educated. They're differently, you know, their socioeconomic priorities are different. You know, coal work, mining work is really tough. It's hard to do. And it's a survival job. You know, taking the bus to work in a high rise is not so much of a survival job, you know. So, you know, we make stories. We create people in our head. And usually we do it in a way that makes us look good or feel good. And yet our feelings are based on something that's not real. It's, you know, it's based on a conjuring of things out of, we're magicians pulling rabbits out of hats. And so again, we will get to what do you do with the observation, but until we become skillful at that, we really can't grasp, you know, how to separate our feelings of the observation from our feelings of the value that we're placing on that observation. There's a difference. Our feelings resulting from a valueless judgment of an observation are different than our feelings of something that we have placed a judgment on. Our feelings of someone pulling in front of us as we're driving along generally will be a little bit, they may be afraid, fear, being scared, maybe being angry, but they're less complicated and usually there's less energy than if we hate the idiot who's driving that car, who may or may not be an idiot, we don't know. But in our worldview, we need them to be an idiot in order to make ourselves feel good. And so we have a lot of energy invested in that. So we will get to your feelings. So please don't think that they're not important or they don't exist or you're not supposed to have them. One of the things I tell people when I'm visiting people in the hospital, especially when I worked in the detox unit, feelings are real. There's no good or bad feeling. What's good or bad is the story that you've constructed to validate those feelings. But when we can feel something, that there's no right or wrong. It's not wrong to feel anger. It's not wrong to feel sadness. It's not wrong to feel betrayed. It's not wrong to feel confused. What we do with that, how we respond to that, and what is it based upon, that's when we get into what's healthy, what's skillful, and what's not skillful or not healthy. It's, anger is okay. But when you punch holes in the wall or punch holes in somebody's face, that gets to be a problem. Okay. So again, I put that out there just so you don't think that you're not allowed to feel anything. You are. We'll get to that. But first we have to get this observation, the first part of the NVC. And does it make sense? Can you see a tie-in to Buddhist philosophy, especially the Eightfold Path of skillful thought, skillful mindfulness? Making any connections? Everybody has to respond. That's my rule, remember? Yes, Neil.
Well, I mean, this is in essence, I think this exercise is just a flavor in a way of right speech, if I may, right? I mean, defining yourself and also, also how you define yourself in with regards to others, right? So in essence, that's also right view, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which are things that we strive to do here on this path.
When I first began studying nonviolent communication, NVC, this was years ago, it's like, man, this is the Eightfold Path. This is how you do it. I mean, the Buddha taught the Eightfold Path, and that's all great. But then what do you do with it? It's like, how do you do it in daily life? How do you do it in our day-to-day, moment-to-moment activities? And so far, NVC, nonviolent communication, is the best thing that I've come across that actually gives us the tools to do the Eightfold Path with. So, yeah, right speech, right thought, right. Yeah, it'll all be in these 4 things of the Eightfold Path. Trey.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you seeing the tie into Buddhism?
Yes, I certainly am. I'm only just now becoming familiar with the Eightfold Path. As you know, I did not study that in the past, but
Right.
from what I can tell, as we've discussed before, it's more about skillful than right, because right is a matter of, perception, but
Yeah.
skillful. I could see how this definitely would, work as a really good way to, or kind of like a guideline to follow, to engage in skillful thought and action. And
Mm-hmm.
so yes, I can see the tie-in on that level as being effective, applicable, easy to use, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of good adjectives.
Sorry.
No, it's good. I I only know that I'm not really good with what's an adjective and an adverb, except that I know that an adverb modifies a verb, and everything else must be an adjective. So, yeah, sorry. That's the extent of my English grammar knowledge. Yes, skillful. Again, choosing not to use the word right, although there's nothing wrong with it. I just feel that in the context of our thinking nowadays, that right is always coupled with wrong. And when we speak of the Eightfold Path and all the 8 rightnesses, we're not talking about in opposition to wrong. So the trend now is to use skillful as opposed to right. But it's not wrong to use right. So, Davey.
Yeah, no, I think it's direct, as you say, it's really applicable to the Eightfold Path. And it reminds me, I'm reading a book, I don't know if you know, Margaret Cram Howie. She wrote a book on using the Lotus Sutra and Nichiren Buddhism to overcome her addiction issues. And
I'm sorry, back up a little bit. What's the name of the book? Slowly.
That book. You probably can't see.
There we go. We need you to, okay, wait. We need you to speak while you're holding up the book, and then everybody else be quiet, because then yours comes up big screen.
Brilliant. It's Dancing in the Garden of the Lotus Sutra. It's by someone called Margaret Cram Howie. And it talks about non-violent communication and how it's applicable, especially to me with all my addiction issues. It kind of, a lot of the source of suffering is when I place my stuff, my thoughts, my preconceptions on other people, and how I'm setting myself to fail. And that pain, that suffering is where the addiction comes from. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right.
And of course, that's easy to talk about and difficult to do.
Yeah, that's where the difficulty is. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, whether we admit to an addiction, regardless of what the addiction is. My views on addiction are a little bit, well, they're not outside the norm. There are many people who have the same views, many professionals, doctors, that we all have addictions. And our behaviors in response to that addiction are crucial. And yes, there's some addictions that theoretically are better for us than others, or worse on us than others. But fundamentally, until we admit that we all have addictions, we're always gonna have a boogeyman. Oh, I'm not like that person. I don't have a drug addiction. So I'm not like that person. Meanwhile, I have a spending addiction or a gambling addiction or something like that. Behavior's the same. So, yeah. And it's difficult. So I appreciate you owning that, saying that there, Davey. I'll have to look for that book. Thanks for Thanks for mentioning it. I'm not familiar with it. It may be a UK publication.
I don't think so. I think she mentions the foreword is by Reverend Cedarman Shonin.
Oh, okay. I'll have to look.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that we had published that book.
Yeah, I'm not sure. He's done the foreword, but I think she's a member of the Seattle Temple.
Yeah. I remember hearing about that. I'll have to. I've not bought that book yet, so I'll have to do that.
It's a good book.
I just looked it up, and it looks like it's available for about $10 on Amazon New.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. So we put a plug in. Anybody who watches this, you can. Anybody who watches this video recording, you can see it later. And there's the pup.
Oh.
So that's who's been down here. So okay. Well, we have about to our normal. I mean, you know, I've scheduled. This is scheduled to be an hour and a half long. So we still have 30 minutes left. So let us go ahead. I'm going to turn on the candles and crank up the incense, and we'll go ahead and do our service. But I'm going to turn the recording off now, and I want to thank each of you all for joining in today, for tolerating what I had hoped it wouldn't be quite disjointed initially, but that's the problem with reading my notes. I have an idea. It reminds me of what's there, but when I try and read it, then it comes out bad. So I appreciate you all humoring me and putting up with it. But I do think that this is important. And for those who watch this later, I hope that you will consider it. And yeah, tune in for the other parts next week. Next week. So we're going to do a service. Either the last, normally I'm just going to put a plug in. Normally the last Sunday of a month is our prayer for healing, prayer for overcoming illness, prayer for the sick. If we can get it all worked out, the last Sunday of this month, we will do a prayer for healing moral wounds, moral injury. And this gets into, sometimes we do things that we know we're not supposed to do, and yet we have no other choice sometimes. Some examples of this, some extreme examples of this are soldiers, people in the military who, contribute to the killing of human beings. When I was in the military during Vietnam, my contribution made that war possible. My effort made that war possible. Soldiers, whether it be Army or Marines or whatever, sometimes have to kill the enemy, even knowing that killing is wrong. Or maybe they didn't know, but they come to be aware of it later and have regrets about the killing that they did. Or sometimes policemen. Sometimes policemen have to hurt somebody, and we'll just set aside police brutality. But sometimes policemen have to hurt somebody, kill somebody, in order to protect a larger group of people. First responders, when you're at a mass casualty scene, you do triage. There's some people you just cannot save, and so you let them go and put your energies to the people that you can save when there's mass casualties. And these have a moral impact. And so we're going to do a service for healing moral wounds. Kanjin Cedarman and I are, I first approached him with the idea last week, and he thought it was a good idea. And so we're going to work on a special ceremony. And we're going to do this jointly. I'll have him join in for our morning service. I'll put it on the calendar and I'll let you all know for sure when it will be, because it might not be until November. And then, starting next year, it will be a part of the regular liturgical calendar, a regular event that we will have every year. And I think it'll be on, I forget which day we picked out, but it corresponds with a national holiday, honoring, it may be first responders, something, but a day for healing moral wounds, moral injury. So we're going to do. I think it's important. We don't often talk about the impact, the silent burdens that people carry for the actions that they have done, and it's not just about killing. Maybe you feel guilty about a behavior or a past action, and you just are really unsettled and suffering because of this feeling of guilt. And how do we heal that? How do we not make it better, but how do we come to terms with that and now, and realize that we're a different person? We've changed. And how can we, in a sense, bring some closure, hopefully, to those things for which we feel a moral hurt? That makes sense. Everybody understand what I'm talking about here?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn the recording off now. And thank you all very much. And let's see.